So I want to thank the IMI for inviting me. I want to say I'm very impressed with, just in my 6-year association with the International Migration Institute, that it is the publications that have come out, the conferences and workshops, the grants, and most importantly, the camaraderie and within and with diaspora. And just to reiterate Stephen Castle's comment, this is not something achieved by professors sitting alone in their offices. I wanted to start off with a little anecdote, or an interview with a family in Valle Alto, Bolivia, in Arlington, Virginia, where they had basically settled. And Don Orlando, the patriarch, has made trips back and forth between Argentina and the U.S. for many years, for 25 years, and so he wants to retire there. But as he sits there with his daughters-in-law who laugh at his idea of returning, they comment that since their husbands are already well integrated into the economy of Arlington, they're construction managers, that this is probably something that will not happen. So this begins my sort of critique of some aspects of transnationalism, but it is very specifically looking at one so-called independent variable, and that is migration permanence, and how this can lead to truncation of transnational ties. It's not an explanation of the many causes of transnationalism, which I acknowledge are quite complex. So transnationalism involves migrants who remain strongly tied to their homeland, sustained by economic, political, and social cultural occupations and activities that require regular long-term contacts across borders for their success, well known to all of you. The keys here are, I think, a strong, regular, long-term. If faced with long-term residence abroad, however, whether induced by political situation or compelled by migrants' own wishes, the question is, do aspirations for return and reinvestment give way to distancing and disinvestment for migrants who may see their lives as less closely and more casually tied to the origin society? So I address two questions in this presentation. First of all, what are the factors that have led to migration permanence since 2000? And secondly, how has this migration permanence influenced transnationalism? And I've limited in scope here. I'm really interested in voluntary labor migration. I'm interested in south to north migration. I'm interested in especially North America and Europe as destinations, and case studies on Bolivia and Mexico, my own experience. So the first question concerns migration permanence since 2000. And I want to just comment on a couple of factors here. The first relates to barriers and the suppression of multiculturalism in the 2000s, which did not exist in the previous decade, at least not nearly as much. 1990s, a time of multiculturalism. The 2000s, a retraction from multiculturalism. And fortified borders then have created a certain forced settlement which has kept previous migrants in place. Return migration has been relatively low. Migration permanence therefore increased. Another factor in this migration permanence has been, what earlier speakers, very interesting talks, have referred to as rumors of opportunities, as with Jurgen's talk yesterday, or the global Western imaginaries, which Paulina discussed yesterday also. And when you combine that with aging populations and a demand for high-touch work, not only has the initiation of migration been increased, but the return migration has actually been curtailed. So, looking at some evidence for this increasing migration permanence as a function of the global economic crisis. So, in the U.S., we have a decline in migration from Mexico, especially strong since 2007, linked to the U.S. recession. Many migrants are not voluntarily returning home, although a number have been deported. So the discussion in the political environment in the U.S. now is around new fences and new walls on the southern U.S. border, which is pretty controversial, except for one particular fence, which might be mentioned, or a particular wall. European immigration has also declined, but more modestly. Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, that is the periphery, which experienced this mobility transition, was faced with out-migration once more and a curtailment of in-migration. So effectively then, in order to preserve their residency rights, many migrants in Europe have remained. A second factor is, for which there's some evidence, relates to perceived opportunities. And again, these Western imaginaries that Paulina discussed yesterday. In Poland, Tim Elric discussed how that the Polish post-accession migrants assimilated into German, Italian, or English values. And in fact, a few years away from home, it felt like that they were really more affiliated with these societies than with their home society. The center of life had shifted to the destination country. Kendall and Massey, in their article on the culture of migration in rural Mexico, Zacatecas in particular, found that aspirations to work in the U.S. Negated the value of education in Mexico, so that children followed the example of their parents and not their advice. Joanna Dreby's ethnographic study of Oaxacan children, very graphic in her recent book in 2010, uncovers rather strongly pro-U.S. values despite the unhappiness and maladjustment faced by children left behind by migrating parents. So transnationalism clearly exists, but it's rather one-sided, with the dominant U.S. culture exerting its psychological hegemony over time. I wanted to point out one little analogy that she finds in her Oaxacan community, and it rotates, so to speak, around the merry-go-round. This is a little game that children play in Oaxaca, and they pretend like this is an airplane. And so as it goes slowly initially, this takes them to another city in Oaxaca, or if a little bit faster, to the capital, the state capital, or if it goes really fast, and this little story never changed, it took them to the U.S. So now looking at the second question, that is, how has migration permanence influenced transnationalism? I want to just briefly discuss this 1994 model of Massey, Goldring, and Durand, which sequentially treats migration as a series of acts which progressively tie the migrant and the migrant's family to the destination. And Massey et al. Write, each act of migration generates a set of irreversible changes in individual motivations, social structures, and cultural values that alter future migration decisions. Access to higher wages creates new standards of material well-being. Migrants make repeated trips abroad. Wives and children join the migrant workforce. More people become involved in the migration process, and stronger links are developed with specific employers. In particular locations, a growing number of migrants then settle in the host society, in this case largely the U.S., because he's talking about their analyses of the Mexican Migration Project data for a number of communities. And migrants adopt new lifestyles, and local economic pursuits become less attractive. 20 years on, research by David Fitzgerald and Roger Waldinger reiterates some of these arguments. In particular, this process that Fitzgerald calls dissimilation, sort of the opposite of assimilation, where migrants at the destination are assimilating into the host society. And at the same time, at the origin, they're dissimilating, and when they return, there's a certain dynamic tension between the returning migrants and their village of origin, and is illustrated by this cartoon based on research in Arandas, Michoacan of Fitzgerald, and it basically says, you know, here are the prodigal sons coming back, or the strangers really, and what do we do with them? You know, their morality has changed, their criticism of village institutions, their new ways of dress and materialism and so forth and so on. And this has created a dissimilation with the returning migrants, and eventually then this passes across to the families in Mexico itself, and there's an alienation there that results in a distancing, and this is the process of dissimilation. I want to present my own rather complex model, which I know needs some work. It's a model of how two basic forces operate, one of them being socioeconomic capital received by the origin from the migrants, and the other is what I call pro-modernization values, which again are received by the origin population. So, point out things here. Well, so we have in this solid upper line, socioeconomic capital initially low because of the costs of paying off coyotes and simply settling in. But as remittances, as time goes on, remittances increase from the short term to the medium term, and so flowing back to the origin, remittances reach a peak. At the same time, the bottom solid line represents a sort of inverse parabola in which pro-modernization values decline as the migrant seeks refuge in his or her culture. Given that the U.S. situation is so difficult, discrimination, loneliness, and so forth, and so this creates a tipping point. And in this model then, many migrants either bring their families at that point, or they create new families at the destination. As a result then, two things happen. That socioeconomic capital line begins to decline, remittances decline, and social remittances also decline. But there's an inculcation of pro-modernization values back to the origin, and so that increases. And the difference between these two lines is what I refer to, the little dotted line there, the hump. That's the net commitment to the origin, which is not in quantitative terms, but very conceptual. And so that reaches a peak at this tipping point in the medium term, and after which it declines. The benefits to the origin, that is the commitment to the origin by the migrants, declines. One more thing in this rather complex model is the if you instead of subtracting these two lines, you add them, you get transnationalism, and that transnationalism remains fairly constant and then declines as you reach the long term due to the dissimilation process that I've described. All right. Empirical examples, a few. In terms of economic transnationalism and the decline of remittances, there seems to be considerable evidence for this. Even return to Aslan, the sort of pioneering book by Massey et al. In 1987. Cornelius's work, the work of Fitzgerald, which I've already discussed, and work in South America and Central America, the Caribbean, by Lowell and de la Garza, points out this increase in remittances to a certain point as a proportion of income, and then a decline after that. So this also has been applied to Ecuadorian and Peruvian immigrants to Spain, or found true, and Jürgens in the study of Turks in Germany, the same. In terms of social-cultural transnationalism, I won't pursue this too much because we've already discussed this in terms of Fitzgerald's work. Sarah Mailer, in studying Salvadorans in Long Island, found an initial period of 5 to 6 years. Transnational ties were strong. After that, a period of greater job stability, and it became quite difficult and formidable even for many migrants to maintain their transnational ties. And then finally, Robert Smith, writing on Tiquari, or writing on the Poblano community of New York City, comments that Tiquari, the Puebloan village, is not actually reproducing itself in New York, but instead emptying out as migration takes on a permanent character. A couple of things in my own research here. One is my research on Mexico in 2 municipios in Zacatecas. One is Villanueva. The other is Jerez. These are close to Zacatecas City, and with the help of Raul and his students, I've been able to make several studies, and Rodolfo at the University of Zacatecas, I've been able to do several studies of those populations over a 14-year interval. And particularly in the case of Jerez, which is the later period, 1995 to 2009, you'll see a clear relationship is over time. The number of working months average has gone up, and the average months abroad on the latest trip, which is sort of an index for migration permanence, has more than doubled. And then finally, my research on Bolivia with Leonardo de la Torre, for which the model was actually, from which the model was actually derived, indicates, in the case of several indicators, economic capital in terms of remittances as a proportion of income goes up, as you can see, and down as you go from short term to middle term to long term. Social capital, which was a response to a question, a family improves its social status through migration, agree or disagree. That agreement went from about half up to 70% and then down to 64%. Values measured in terms of, again, certain response to certain questions in my questionnaire. Modernization of values went down and then up. Agreement with statements criticizing local institutions went down and then up. And finally, my intention to return to Bolivia went up and then down in a fairly significant justification, or at least suggestions that the model has some possible validity. So conclusions: a global reduction in international migration has refocused the earlier debate on the trade-off between assimilation, previously on the way out, age of migration quote there, and transnationalism is now out, and it seems assimilation is back in again. Studies of migrants and their families in many different settings seem to support this model that I presented. Although transnationalism may be desirable from the perspective of origin societies, maximization of remittances, and destination societies, providing labor without paying the cost of permanent settlement, this middle period I've been talking about, it may not be so from the perspective of the individual and the family. When the host culture is dominant in terms of its economic development and modernized values, the decline follows a certain trajectory which I have described. And finally, this scenario has a positive effect on migrant destination family, a negative effect on the origin and those left behind, and a neutral effect on the destination itself. So that's all. Thank you very much.